some of those same attitudes, even though we may not be teaching falsely. We might have some of the attitudes that they have that cause them to be false teachers. So in verse, I just want to read 1 through 3 to get that before us. I don't want to discuss that per se. And then we'll start with verse 4, and we'll start with Mark, and we'll work our way to the back. And let's read through, we'll read through verse 9. So I'm going to read verse 1 through 3 first. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of truth will be maligned. And in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. So we've talked a lot in the past. When Chuck was here, we talked a lot about what's worse, preaching a lie or believing a lie. Well, both, right? So if the false teachers taught falsely, and then people believe them, and he said, these will come, and people will believe these false teachers. So it's not anything new to us, and so we want to understand a little bit more about that. So let's read Mark, start in verse 4, and we'll go through verse 9, and we'll go backwards until we finish through verse 9. Yeah, a couple verses apiece.
For God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them to the chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. He did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, and preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly.
And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example of those who afterward were lived ungodly, and delivered righteousness Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. So that righteous man dwelling among them, according to his righteous soul, did it by seeing and hearing that their lawless deeds. And the Lord knows how to deliver from godly temptations, and to reserve the unjust unto punishment of the day of judgment.
So here we're looking at, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, and this is an area that a little bit that Jeremy spoke about and referenced Jude when he was here, talking about there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily hear a lot more about in the scriptures other than what's mentioned here. But evidently, if God did not spare angels when they sinned, so there evidently were angels that were cast down and cast into hell. That if he didn't spare them, and in verse 5, if he did not spare the ancient world from the flood, if he didn't spare Sodom and Gomorrah, but he rescued Lot, he rescued Noah, then for us, there's that comfort that we have that he's going to take care of us as well if we have that right attitude of not following false doctrine. So Noah was spared from the flood, right? So the flood did what? It did two things, one on one side and one on the other. So it
what, like judge the world?
Right. It judged the world, right? For those who were not righteous, they killed them all, right? They're all gone. But what about on the flip side? Right. Right. So the flood saved them. So God brought Noah and his family, through the flood, even though everyone else who was unrighteous was killed. So in like manner, those who believe a false teacher, they're going to be destroyed. Those who don't believe a false teacher have the opportunity to rise above that false teaching. They don't have to be subject to that. And if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, but he rescued Lot, right? So the same thing, fire and brimstone, right? He destroyed those cities because they were unrighteous, right? But just because Lot lived in those ungodly cities where false teaching occurred, sin was abounding. Did he give in to that?
No.
No. So, like us, do we live in a world similar to Sodom and Gomorrah? Right? I mean, are we in the majority or the minority in following truth? We're in the minority, right? Broad is the gate, right, that leads to destruction, right? So the world that we live in today tells us all kinds of things that we should be doing, but it's sin, right? We don't have to give in to that. In verse 8, for by what he saw and heard the righteousness of man when Lot was living there, he didn't have to give in to that, to their lawless deeds. For the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation. So how are we rescued from temptation? God zap us and does he pull us out of that situation?
Use of prayer.
Right? Prayer can help us. So how, Warren?
Well, actually, we know the truth. And we have to apply that to the word. Determine whether it's right or wrong. Or if it's debatable, it's probably wrong. It's that's the storyline. If you got to think about it too long, it's not right to do it to start.
Right, so
we have to have our faith truth for it. We can make our judgment.
Right, so having known the truth, does that mean we're always going to follow the truth?
No.
We do our best.
Yeah.
And up here in verse 8, it said that Lot was tormented by his righteous day to day. He was tormented by the evil that was around him, and to me, he didn't give in. So I mean, to me, it takes a strong faith, not to give in, and of course, knowing the truth and believing the truth, because a lot of people don't believe that there's a hell. So I mean, to me, just having that strong faith, day to day, like Lot did. The word tormented is pretty strong.
Right. Anybody disagree with that? Are we tormented, tempted that we should sin? Is every day a breeze? Does anybody have any temptations we have every day? Right. It doesn't mean we have to give into that. Mark?
There's probably a good reason why we're told that Satan is like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may destroy, because the moment you make up your mind that you want to be a disciple of Christ and follow his teaching, you get lined up in the gun sights that moment. And Satan does not relent. It is every day. There's no holidays. There's no sick days. It's 24/7 pretty much.
Right, and I think you'd agree. Some days are easier than others. Some situations we know we're going to be in, it's going to be more difficult. I mean, when we're here versus when we're at work or other places, we don't think about some of the same situations that might tempt us to sin when we're here. And that doesn't mean when we're here that we can't sin, but we have our guard up no matter where we are. But when we're in the world of those situations we know about that are going to tempt us even more, that's when our guard should be even higher.
Well, I mean, just like Mark said, that like a roaring lion. Well, we see a roaring lion, but we also need to remember that they're also dressed in sheep's clothing, so it's not so clear. We've got to be careful of those. Right,
and that's what we're going to talk about here a lot in this false teaching is that, and Dan talked about it. That when you look out in the denominational world today, what you hear on TV or radio, some of it's very easy to understand that that's false teaching. Some of it, a word or two just changed here or there, it can make all the difference in the world. And if you're not paying attention, you'll be sucked into that. It's like, and go off and do something that you find out later is like, I didn't pay enough attention to that. That really was something I should have been more focused on. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, we can read that common scripture on how God saves us from temptation, or how God allows us to. And who read last? Okay, Dan or Mallory, if you could read 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13.
No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation will also provide the way of escape, you may be able to endure it.
Right, so that in all these situations, but the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation. Right? And the way he rescues the godly is he provides an escape. Right? There's an escape that's always there. But sometimes we're not looking for that escape so much. So that, I mean, not saying that God provides specifically, oh, here's your escape, but we know that there's always, we don't have to give in to the temptation. Dan?
Right, I mean, your point, right? It may not be as obvious as the exit sign for a building, right? But right, this is the flip side of verse 3 back in Second Peter 2, right? Where he talks about how the destruction of wrongdoers is not sleep, right? That all of these things are being observed and are being perceived, right? Even if we're not seeing something immediate, we need to have confidence based on this. What they're doing is noted is not correct. Also, that we are being, our conduct is being noted, and our way of escape should also be.
Right, and it's fairly prevalent today, and I haven't been in one, and maybe some of you have these escape rooms where you go into as a group, you go into this situation, and you're all locked into this room, and there's some way to escape out of this situation, and you have to. It's not like Dan said. There's no exit sign that says, "Oh, well, you just open the door and walk out." As a group or as a team, you have to work together and figure out how do we get out of this situation. What's the out? And that's why we as individuals, sometimes that way out of sin isn't so obvious, and maybe it's because we're not looking hard enough, but it's there. We don't have to give into it, and so we have to be more focused on sometimes on finding what that escape is, because God says it's always there. You don't have to sin. So in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 10, let's start there and let's read down through maybe verse 16. So 10 through 16, we'll take 2 verses apiece.
And especially those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority. Bearing self-will, they do not tremble when they revile and judge majesties, whereas angels who are greater in might and power do not bring a reviling judgment against them before the Lord.
But these people bless me in matters they do not understand. They are like unreasoning animals, creatures of instinct, born only to be caught and destroyed. Like animals, they too will perish. They will be paid back harm for the harm they have done. The idea of pleasures, caress, gross in the broad daylight. They are lost in blemishes, reveling in their pleasures while they feast with you.
Having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls, are they that exercise without practices, first children, which have forsaken the right way and have gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness.
But was rebuked for his own transgression. His teachers taught he spoke with human voice, restraining the prophet's madness.
So in verse 10, says especially those, we're talking about the Lord knows how to rescue the ungodly from temptation, to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. And it says especially those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority. So it seems like there's some extra emphasis put on here, especially those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authorities. Now there's obviously a grouping here of an area where especially those who indulge in these fleshly things and corrupt desires more so than others. Why that is, just seems to be an extra focus on those kind of people who indulge in those things. But in the second part of verse 10, daring, self-willed, they do not tremble when they revile angelic majesty. So whatever this angelic majesties is here that was spoken of, whereas angels who are greater in might and power do not bring a reviling judgment against them before the Lord. So even angels don't bring a judgment against angels that have fallen. So the point is here, these people are so daring and self-willed that that they do things that even angels wouldn't do to. So how do we handle people who have fallen from? Think about that. Hopefully, if our members fall away, we wouldn't handle them in such a way where we would revile against them. Angels don't even do that. So, as brothers and sisters in Christ, if someone falls away, we should be wanting to bring them back to the Lord, right? So we should be focusing on what can we do to help bring them back. Talk about these false teachers are daring and self-willed. Is that a surprise that a false teacher would be like that? No. Many false teachers would knowingly, and most probably do, knowingly teach falsely. Others might not be aware that they're teaching falsely until maybe they find the truth and they say, oh, well, I don't care about the truth. I'm still going to teach falsely. But they're looking out for themselves, right? They're daring, basically daring God. I'm going to do what I want to do, and I don't care what your word says. I'm going to do those things. But in verse 12, but these, like unreasoning animals, born as creatures of instinct, to be captured, reviling where they have no knowledge, will the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed. Suffering wrong is the wages of doing wrong. They count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. So what does that tell you about somebody who revels in the daytime versus typically, under the cover of darkness?
They don't care.
They don't care. I don't care what you say. God, I don't care what you said. I'm going to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it, and I don't care what anybody else says to me. Revel in the daytime. They count it a pleasure. They are stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions as they carouse with you. Having eyes full of adultery, they never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having a heart trained in greed, accursed children. Having a heart trained in greed. How do you train your heart to be greedy? Does a little child grow up to be greedy? I know kids play together. Let me take your toy. Right? But I'm talking about a parent, who's training their child up to be greedy like that. But how do we, as Christians, or as people, how can we train our heart to be greedy?
Well, I think greed is the result of self-discipline and self-denial. Because like you said, with little children, I don't think we necessarily would call them greedy, but they do want what other people have. And that's just their natural, that's the developmental stage. And if you don't train them out of that, that's the fault. That's the way you're going to be. So greed is kind of like your default, and you have to train yourself out of it. It's self-denial, self-control that you don't always get what you have. So when it's talking about the creatures and stuff, they're just looking out for self, fulfilling whatever they want, and not thinking bigger picture.
Right, so training them out of being greedy, and if you have that greedy aspect, then you need to be trained out of that, right? If that's more natural of wanting what someone else has, envy, greed, covetousness, all those things that we're warned about. So if we don't train our children out of that, we're essentially training them to be like that. And then as Christians, we can do the same way. So as false teachers are greedy for what? Money, right? Notoriety, power. Power. I heard. I think Chuck mentioned to me once. I don't remember. It was from here or from the pulpit, or was it personally? But how even a gospel preacher told him that he was told by his elders not to preach on a certain subject. And he said, and Chuck said, well, you went along with that? He said, yeah, I've got a family to feed, right? So if you think about that, I want the money that I'm getting as preaching here because I need to feed my family. So even though you don't want me to preach on a subject that I think should be preached on and we disagree, I'll abide by what you tell me not to preach on, even though it's something that's scriptural that should be preached on, which is, it's wrong for an eldership, to do that. But because I want money, power, I wouldn't call it so much power in that situation, but I want the money to feed my family. I'm not going to go someplace else and preach the truth in its entirety. I'll stay here and let someone else, have that sway over me. But the end of verse 14, where he says, "Accursed children." So this lends itself to, these are children of God. These are children that are, a fallen angel, a false teacher. You knew the truth, and now you're not teaching it. You're an accursed child. You trained your heart in greed. And I think I wanted to get into that area a little bit, and I know this is going to cause us to think about some things that, but I think there's the things that we need to talk about. A heart trained in greed is a heart that's deceptive. And there's a lot of things in this world that, little white lies, little things that we can get caught up in and not think about, how deceptive something is. Inappropriate activities. So and I'm not going to get into, a lot of the details of that, but there's just, as an example, if you were to say at spring break, and I'm going to take my children to Las Vegas. So you'd probably look at somebody and say, it's called Sin City for a reason, right? Why would you want to take your kids on a vacation to Las Vegas? I would say most people would probably say that's probably not a good idea. Let's not do that. There's a lot of things that go on there. Not to say that you couldn't go there and go to the mountains and do some other things like that, but just say when you would say that I'm going to go to Las Vegas to take my kids to there, right? So that's not a good idea. But instead, let's say, I'm going to the beach. Depends on where you go to the beach. Right? There are places when you go to the beach, I could go to the beach dressed like this and sit in the middle of everybody who's not dressed like this. That's not a good idea. And we deceive ourselves, I think, sometimes by going to those places and saying, it's okay for me to do this and not partake. Right? I'm not dressed like they are. I'm in the middle of a bunch of people who aren't dressed appropriately, but I'm dressed appropriately. That for some reason, that's okay. And that's looked at just generically, I'm just saying in general, better than saying I'm going to Las Vegas, right? A lot of places on the beach, you can go get a house, you can go out in the middle of nowhere, you can get away from those things. But you can't raise your children, and even as adults, and go to those places and think that, if you have children, later on when they get older, I'm going to tell them they can't do that. But right now, while they're little, we can. If little Johnny and Susie can wear a bathing suit at 2, and 7, 15, you get to the point where you've raised them in a way that you're now telling them is okay, but you're preaching and you're hearing preaching that's not okay. So we deceive ourselves in a lot of ways where, we're not being smart about training our hearts. We train our heart for greed. We train our hearts for good things. We shouldn't train our hearts for being deceptive and looking for every angle on how can I make this situation benefit me? Anything I can do to save a buck, right? Sometimes you may have a situation where you have something shipped to you that you didn't order. Well, I'm going to keep it. Nope. That doesn't belong to you. You got to send it back. Oh, well, they overshipped me. I'm sorry. I'm going to keep it. Nope. Send them back. Well, it's going to take a lot of effort. Nope. Send it back. Little things like that we find in our lives, that we do that are wrong. Many of you know Chuck was a big hockey fan. And his Leafs were playing in the playoffs. And so he came over to watch the Leafs on my TV because he didn't have it. But prior to that, I said, well, here, you can just sign into my ESPN account. He said, and he thought about that. And he called me back later and said, I can't do that. He said, that's stealing. I don't have an account. I'm not paying for that account. You give me your password. You're paying for that service. I can come over to your house and watch it. But you can't give me that account and have me sign in because I'm sinning. I'm stealing a service. I don't pay for that. It's not like borrowing somebody's car, right? You're not paying for it because you don't want to pay for it. Little deceptive things that we do like that in everyday life that everybody else out in the world says, it's okay. You don't even have to think about it. But when you think about it, it's like, yeah, now that you brought it up, I shouldn't be doing that. Do we look for the advantage? When we're looking for the advantage for everything that's going to work for me, how can I make this work out to benefit me? Then that's where we're not being the Christian that we should. We're looking out for self, no different than these false teachers are looking out for themselves. How can I benefit me in this situation? It's a bad situation to be in. You know, the world would say you're street smart. You're savvy, right? No, you're a sinner. It's sin. That's what it's called. And that's why we need to be careful about those kind of things. Okay, 2 Peter, let's look at in verse 15. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray, following the way of Balaam the son of Beor, who loved the wages of righteousness. Balak was trying to get Balaam to curse Israel. He wouldn't do that, but only if God would allow him to do that. But but Balaam, was offered a reward. Balak said, "I'll give you this reward if you'll do this." He kept trying to find a way to get that reward. He wanted that reward of being unrighteousness and being deceptive. He received a rebuke for his own transgression from his donkey, if you remember that. And in verse 17, these are springs without water and mist driven by a storm, for whom the black darkness has been reserved. So a spring without water, it gives you this empty deception, right? Here's a spring, here's a well, I'm going to go to drink. Oh, there's no water there. It's empty, there's nothing there. I think we stopped in verse 16, so we haven't actually read 17 where I'm discussing there. So let's read, Warren, if you would, let's read 17 through 22. We'll go ahead and finish out the chapter, and we'll go 2 verses apiece. And Jordan, if you would just finish it off when it gets to you. To Warren, go at 17 and 18.
These are wells without water, clouds carried by a tempest, of whom is reserved the blackness of the darkness forever. For when they speak great flowing words of emptiness, they allure from the lusts of the flesh to the rudest, the ones who have actually escaped from those who live in the air.
While they promise them liberty, they themselves are the servants of corruption. For whom a man is overcome, of the same he is brought into bondage. For if, after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled therein and overcome, the latter end is worse with them than with them.
For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than, having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment handed on to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb, the dog returns to its own vomit, and the sow, after washing, returns to wallowing in the mire.
Right, so it mentioned in verse 17 before we started reading here that a spring without water and mists or clouds driven by a storm, they don't produce any rain. The spring doesn't have any water there. These are areas where it's just an emptiness. For speaking out arrogant words of vanity, this vain things that don't mean anything. They entice your fleshly desires by sensuality, those who barely escape from the ones who live in error, promising them freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption. when you think about false teachers, right, they promise you freedom. They promise you health and wealth and right, all these kind of things. And what we hear about today in false teaching, if we were to listen to radio or watch the television about things, they're promising you things that they themselves are already caught up in this corruption. And they're telling you to come out of this sinful world and come into what they're offering. And what they're offering is sin as well. So they're not offering you anything. It's vain, right? It's like a well without water. There's no substance to it. There's nothing there. So to believe that, you go out of sin and you go into more sin. Or maybe you go out of a lot of sin and you go into less sin. Are you still sinning? You're still a sinner, right? And that's what this is telling us here. There's no promise to that. They promise you freedom, but it's still captivity, right? You're still in sin. There's nothing for us there. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. So you're enslaved in sin if you're overcome by sin. So, the more you do that, you're enslaved to that, those desires. In verse 20, for if after they have escaped the defilements of the world by the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and are overcome, the last state was worse for them than the first. In other words, you knew the truth. At one time you knew the truth, and you said, I'm not doing that. I'm going to give it up. So you're worse off than had you never known the truth. Because there are people out there who didn't know the truth. They're both still sinners. But you knew what was wrong, and you gave it up. You knew what was right. You followed that, and for whatever reason, you gave it up. How many of us know Christians that have fallen away, right? You know the truth, but a lot of people will say that's just too hard for me, right? I can't do that. I can't be that good. I can't follow God that much. I want to follow Him this much, but not that much. So I'm going to do nothing. I'm just going to give it up. Matt?
Well, I think when you look at, it talks about how much worse it'll be for them. It's not necessarily like, some people believe there's different degrees of punishment in the afterlife. It's not that that's the case, but we can see from the rich man and Lazarus, there's consciousness after death. And, you imagine being, the truth, you are doing the truth, and then for one reason or another you fall away, and then you get to spend all eternity thinking about, wow, I knew what I should have done. All I had to do was do it, and here I am for all eternity. And just like we see, the rich man that he knew, and that was part of his torture was he knew, and it'd almost be better to be there and be like, well, I had no idea, than it would be to realize, what, I could have done something about this, and I just chose not to.
Right, and as teachers and people that we should be examples to others. It wasn't telling other people that if we don't speak to them or teach them about the word of the gospel, it's almost like we're saying, well, I'm not going to teach you because if I teach you, then you're going to have to give up stuff, and then you may fall away, and it's going to be really hard on you. So maybe you shouldn't hear it. That's almost like what we're saying. It's going to be too hard if I teach you. No. We have the opportunity to live the Christian life if we teach someone. Granted, it's not an easy life, but having known it, and then you said, I don't want it. You seek the truth, you find it, and then you say, oh, now that I found it, it's too hard. And many people do that. In verse 21, for it would be better for them not to have known it, which we've been talking about, the way of righteousness, the having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment handed on to them. So what's the whole of man? All right. Fear God and keep His commandments. The whole of man. That sums up, what we're to do, as created beings on this earth. That's why we're put here, to fear God and keep His commandments, right? And you can add, to teach others. But if fear God and keep His commandments. Of course, one of those commandments is to teach others, and so many other things. But everything else, if you do fear God, then you will keep His commandments. If you don't fear God, you're not going to keep His commandments. It's not going to be by chance that you keep His commandments if you're not fearing God. So, it's better to never have known those things. And then in the last verse, we have about 6 minutes here. It has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to his own vomit, and a sow after washing returns to wallowing in the mire. I don't know how many of you have a dog, but I do, and it's pretty gross when they do that, and they do that, right? But when you expel something that your body doesn't want, and then you end up eating it again, that's it's a gross picture. But that's what he's talking about here. A sow after washing, and I have a dog as well. We just washed you, and you went outside and you got all muddy, right? Doesn't know better. But after having been clean, that's what it's talking about. After having been clean, you went back into the world. Now, as Christians, after we've gone out if we've fallen away, if we sin, we can repent and come back. So we don't have to stay muddy, right? We can get clean again. Bernice, I think
I was asking, it was verse 21. Why is it better to have not known? I don't understand that because it's still the same end result. What is that? Verse 21.
Was it better to not have known?
Yeah,
the truth.
For after they have okay, Pop.
Right. So if you, Bernice, so if you don't know the truth, then you don't know that you're doing anything wrong.
But you're still going to hell.
Right. But if you don't know that,
right,
you're still going there, but you don't know that you're going there because you don't know the truth. Right. If you don't know the truth, you can't know that what you're doing is wrong. Right. But if you know the truth, now I know what I was doing is wrong, and I'm now following the Lord, and I know what I should do, and I know that there's right and there's wrong. And now if I go back to wrong after I knew the truth, you're worse than you were. Before you never knew it, you were ignorant of the fact that there's any right or wrong. And now that you know it, you said.
Only difference to me is that the person don't have to worry. They don't have that in their conscience of worrying about what they know.
Right, but that's why he said it's work. It's work because now you know better. When a child doesn't know better to do something, then you're still disciplined. You're trying to train them. But once you taught them, and now they disobey you, they do better. And then they said, I don't care. Now,
at least while we're living and even after death, it's that concept of guilt. Guilt is one of the worst things you have to live with. So if you don't know you've done it, you don't have that guilt. But as soon as someone's told you, hey, you lied to me, then you feel that guilt. And it's like, I'm going to try everything to not have this guilt. So that's what it's saying. It's not saying that it's okay to live in sin ignorantly, but it's saying you don't have that guilt of knowing you live in sin. And that's what the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They didn't necessarily know, they needed the law to tell them, hey, this is wrong. But prior to knowing what was wrong, it was still wrong. They just didn't have the guilty conscience of living with, hey, I've done wrong. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
it's still wrong.
Yeah, I know.
You're violating God's will. But if you don't know that, it's worse. It's worse to know it and then to say, I'm not going to do it.
Right.
Jordan, I think it kind of goes to Hebrews 10:26, where it talks about if we continue sinning willfully after coming to the knowledge of the truth. And then it goes into talking about how when you forsake the law of Moses, you die without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Then it talks about how, if we know Jesus and we turn away from him, essentially what we're doing is trampling underfoot the Son of God. And we just say, hey, I knew you, Lord. I knew what you had to offer. But I knew the way of righteousness, but I'm going to go my own way. I'm going to forsake you. And it's like we're trampling underfoot his blood, and we're just putting his name to open shame. And then what our brother mentioned about that consciousness that we have when we're in hell with the rich man and Lazarus, like that. The rich man, he was still conscious. So if you're somebody who knew the truth and you turned away and ended up in hell, you're gonna be conscious. Like, I knew the truth, I knew what I should have did, but I didn't do it, and you're gonna have to live with that for a whole eternity. So,
Right. There's one, Mark.
I was just going to say, if you look at it from the standpoint of consequence, let's say that you have a flat tire. Well, it's a hassle, it's a noise. But if somebody told you a week before, hey, your tire is low, and you just ignore it, and you end up on the side of the road, which is the worst circumstance? The one where it just happened and you had no knowledge, or the one where you were plainly told that you got a problem there.
Right. And I think that's a good point. So thanks everyone for their participation. It's time to ring the bell now, but we'll Mark's teaching the class next week, and we'll start with 2 Peter chapter 3.
They just got